home court.
I know, that's so nice. Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started if you want to find your seats. This is very fun. I first want to wish everyone Moadim L'Simcha and Happy Pesach. I saw many of you here for our congregational Seder, and many of you I know had wonderful Seders with family and friends, and I hope that you've had a good and meaningful Pesach so far. Yossi, we're so glad to see you back here at Temple Sholom.
Really delighted to be here. I was just telling the rabbi that I feel like it's my home court. So I'm really happy to be back with you.
We love being your home court. No, truly, it's such a wonderful relationship and connection that we've built this last few years. And, you know, when we asked Yossi if he would like to connect with us again this spring and what we should do, he was very gracious and said he would love to, but that, you know, it would be nice to not come up and give a lecture, but just have a conversation, first between the two of us, and then to extend it to all of you to be able to ask Yossi some questions about things you're thinking about Israel, about the Jewish world, about Jewish Canada. All these different topics are really, really interesting and meaningful for us to discuss together tonight. So I want to actually start, Yossi, with a question that really was raised in my mind from the Seder table, which was about how much emphasis to put on the hostages in our Pesach Seders this year. Last year it was very clear. It was immediate. It was the first Pesach after October 7th. And this year it felt like, in some ways, al achat kama v'chama, all the more so. It felt like we know more about the hostages, the conditions, those who have come back in the recent months tell us about. We know exactly the condition of many of the living hostages are in right now. And at the same time, I wonder about, you know, why the hostages seem to be stuck. It seems like there's no momentum around the hostages right now. Is that accurate, that perception? And if so, why do you think that is?
I mean, for me personally, this Seder felt a lot more urgent in terms of the hostages than last year. Last year, and again, I'm speaking from a subjective place, the primary focus for me was the war, bringing down Hamas. And this was before the beepers, before we had really reestablished the credibility of our deterrence. And that seemed to me really an existential need. And we've done that. And so now the question is putting the fate of the hostages even before defeating Hamas. And that's a position that now something like 70% of Israelis agree with, which was not the case a year ago. A year ago, you would have probably had a majority of the country saying we need to prioritize the war, even at the cost of deferring the release of the hostages. So something basic has changed. But what hasn't changed is the approach of the government. And that's why things feel stuck. And Netanyahu and his whole approach to the hostages has been one of the most disgraceful aspects of this government of disgrace. And I say that because, you know, there are two reasonable positions here. And Israeli society is divided. And again, even though a majority of Israelis today do affirm the primacy of the hostages, many people feel, and I feel, I have an understanding for the other position, which says, no, we still have to prioritize of no one reaching out to comfort, no one coming to the Shiva. And so it's a disgraceful government. We have never experienced anything like this before. Some supporters of Netanyahu have physically attacked families demonstrating against the government. And when Liri Elbag, one of the released hostages, recently came out with a strong statement about Netanyahu, saying, you're the reason that I was in captivity, you're the reason the hostages are still there, and I expect you to make that right. She was attacked on social media in such a vicious way, and there was so much pushback against the Netanyahu camp for this that Netanyahu felt politically impelled to call her. But he didn't denounce publicly, he didn't denounce the social media attack on Liri. And so there's a sense of disbelief in Israel that we have a government that behaves this way toward hostages whom this government is responsible for their captivity in the first place and for their prolonged captivity. And Netanyahu has never spoken to the nation about the hostages. He's never given the talk that any normative Israeli prime minister would have long since done. And certainly Netanyahu could have invoked his brother and said, I come from a family that has paid a very heavy price for saving hostages. And he's incapable, he's emotionally incapable of doing the most minimal outreach to the Israeli public, to the families. So that's part of, I think, what's going on.
Is anyone filling that vacuum of that voice of comfort or leadership?
Yeah, Israeli society, just ordinary Israelis who have embraced the families, who turn out in tens of thousands every week to demonstrate for the hostages, sometimes hundreds of thousands. And it's really been on that level. It's been and that I think is in some ways representative of how the Israeli public has reacted since October 7th. No one told Israelis what to do on October 8th. Everyone knew they needed to show up in their reservist units, and civilians showed up to volunteer in any number of ways. Something like 50% of Israelis participated after October 7th in some form of volunteerism, which is just an extraordinary number. It also included many Arabs, by the way. And so there was this sense of Israeli society mobilizing itself. No one waited to hear, well, what does Netanyahu think we should do? And this, I feel, and I may have said this the last time I was here, but I feel that the post-October 7th period has really been the maturation of Israeli society, because this is the first time we went to war with no faith in the decency of our government. Israelis always doubt the wisdom of our leaders, especially during war. You think about Levi Eshkol, the prime minister during the Six-Day War. Israelis thought he was a ludicrous figure. He was not. I think he was a superb prime minister. But at the time, Israelis felt we're going to war with a half-wit. Literally, that was the perception of Levi Eshkol. And of course, Golda Meir was forced to resign after the Yom Kippur War. So was Menachem Begin after the First Lebanon War, Olmert after the 2006 war. So we always mistrust the wisdom of our leaders during war. But this is the first time that we didn't trust the decency and I'll say it, even the patriotism of our leadership. According to polls, a majority of Israelis believe that Netanyahu places his personal interests ahead of the interests of the country during war. We've never had that before. No one ever doubted that Golda Meir placed the interests of the country before her own political interests. The question was she competent? And that's a different question. This time, we went to war convinced that our leadership is morally corrupt. And many of us believe that this war is being prolonged and the fate of the hostages is being decided not on the basis of what's good for the country, but what's good for the government. And whether that perception is true or not, the fact that so many Israelis believe it is a real problem, because it means that there's a tremendous demoralization.
Is the civil society that you said, stepped up on October 8th and still showing up for the hostages, what do you think is, they've, it's similar groups that's been out since before October 7th with the democracy protests. How long can that last? It seems like they're running on fumes. They must be. It's just exhausting. And I've read recently that there are, more reservists who are not showing up for their callbacks and things like that. Are you seeing, I guess, an energy to put aside the politics and the government, but from the civil society, from Israeli society, to keep the course, to change the course? How do you see this going forward in the near future?
So in terms of the reservists, we have not fought a war of this length since 1948. 1948 war was about 2 years. People were in uniform for 2 years. The Yom Kippur War and its aftermath was around 5 or 6 months. We're coming close to 2 years. We're getting there. We're a year and a half into this war with no end in sight. There are reservists who have been fighting for 500 days and have just been called up again. So families are at the breaking point. Businesses are failing. Academic careers are faltering. People are paying enormous price for this war. And so we are seeing the beginnings of a crack in the reservist, what's the English word? The reservoir of reservists. In terms of civil society, and especially the protest movement, the success of the protest movement is that it seems to be inexhaustible. The failure of the protest movement is that it hasn't drawn in larger groups. It's still pretty much the same people that have been doing this for the last 2.5 years. And the numbers, fluctuate. There are tens of thousands rather than hundreds of thousands. In the year leading up to October 7th, you would get 100, 200,000 people on a Saturday night. Now it's tens of thousands, which still, 2+ years of demonstrations later, I think I can't think of another protest movement, another democratic protest movement anywhere proportionally that has sustained that level of numbers in the street. So I think it's still a relative success story. And the question really is, how do we widen the scope of these demonstrations? And my feeling is that we need to switch gears, because it's now clear that whoever is out there demonstrating for democracy, that's who there is. And either the rest of the country is apathetic or doesn't believe that democracy is really under threat, or with a certain percentage of the society, a minority, maybe around 30%, according to polls, supports the government. So my sense is that we need to be focusing on different issues, especially if we're going to bring the government down. We should be creating a mass movement to draft the ultra-Orthodox. On that issue, there is virtual wall-to-wall support, especially among religious Zionists, who have been carrying a great deal of the burden of this war. Disproportionate number of casualties are coming from the religious Zionist community. And there is the beginnings of a protest movement there among the wives. Very interesting. It's still not a mass movement, although there was a petition a few months back by over 1,000 women from the religious Zionist community, an open letter to the mothers in the ultra-Orthodox community, saying, why are we the only ones who are having sleepless nights? And very powerful. So that's the first issue that I think we should be broadening the coalition over. And the second issue is a question of national unity. Regardless of whether you support Netanyahu or support the assault on the judiciary, is this really the issue that should be tearing us apart in the middle of a war? Bad enough that the government did this in the year leading up to October 7th. Who would have believed on October 8th that the government would resume its assault on the judiciary during a war? Who would believe that the government would be treating the head of the Shabak, the Shin Bet, as public enemy number one during a war? It's actually madness what we're seeing now. It is the breakdown of every Israeli norm that we always took for granted. And so on that basis, I think we could really expand the protest movement, but it can't be the same people who led the movement until now, because for many Israelis, they're burned. And I understand that, because the protest movement made one major mistake in leading up to October 7th, and that was supporting the move of pilots and others to not serve. And that had a tremendous negative impact on much of Israeli society. We lost a lot of support there. It was a very effective weapon. It actually stopped the judicial assault for a while, but we paid a very high price for it, and I think that the army needs to be outside of these political debates. And so the fact that the democratic movement's leadership is identified with that unpopular policy is, I think, holding us back.
So you briefly mentioned the assault on the head of the Shin Bet, and we were talking a little bit at dinner about the Qatar gate, the whole Qatar issue going on, and you mentioned that you thought that this was a bigger deal than some of the other things that Bibi was facing. Can you explain kind of why that is? How is these, like, are there, in terms of broadening that coalition, are there Israelis who are more concerned about that than the other kind of corruption cases?
I mean, Qatar is a formidable enemy of Israel. It built the Hamas military infrastructure. It sponsors Al Jazeera, which is one of the most important anti-Israel media outlets in the world, aside from the BBC. And I have to say it. And so I don't know the CBC, but the sense, the fact that Netanyahu's innermost circle was penetrated by Qatari money, and there is no one closer to Netanyahu than these people who were exposed as being on the Qatari payroll, with the exception of his son Yair in Miami, who I'm certain was on the Qatari payroll. And I mean, these were his closest friends. He brought these people to his father's inner circle. And so we're looking at something we've never seen in Israel before. I mean, there are so many, can you believe this moments in Israel now. We're really at dealing with a scandal about Qatari money penetrating Netanyahu's closest circle of advisors, and there are people in Israel who are defending this or are accusing the media or the Shin Bet of politicizing the scandal. It's hard to recognize this country. And so this leadership, from my point of view, in case you haven't gathered yet, I'm not a supporter of this government, and it's a tragedy because I think Netanyahu in the past was a very fine leader, deeply flawed. He was always deeply flawed, but he was a significant leader. And since he fell into his legal difficulties, he has really betrayed himself. He's betrayed his own legacy. And it's not a question of left or right. To my mind, it's a question of basic decency and upholding the Israeli ethos. So until this government goes, we're just going to, I think, continue to be in a can you believe it moment.
So we'll have Q&A in a little bit, so hold your questions. I want to bring up another flawed world leader. So there was this big story in the New York Times today about Trump that to swing to Iran, that he basically kind of called off what was going to be an Israeli strike with American support on Iran. And I'm wondering how you're feeling about that. I know you're always very concerned about Iran, so love your opinion.
Yeah, I've been a super hawk on Iran for 20 years. That's when I started writing about this. It was in around 2005, 6. And I felt we should attack Iranian facilities then. And I've respected Netanyahu for galvanizing an international awareness about the nuclear program. But Netanyahu turns out to be bluster. We should have attacked Iranian nuclear facilities at any number of times along the way, but certainly in the months before Trump came into power. When we had destroyed Iran's anti-air system, anti-air defenses, it was wide open. And I couldn't believe that Mr. Iran, Mr. Security, was not going to hit Iran then. And it was clear to me that once Trump came in, it was going to be Trump who would call the shots on Iran, and Netanyahu would essentially do whatever direction Trump wanted to go in. He could have defied Biden. That's part of the irony here. Biden would not have, I don't think, even if we had defied Biden on Iran, I don't think we would have paid a very high price with Biden. And with Trump, you don't know. Trump can wake up tomorrow and say, okay, go ahead and do it. Or he can wake up tomorrow and come up with a deal that's an even worse deal than the Obama deal, which I thought was an historic disaster. And he'll promote that as the deal of the 21st century. So he's so erratic. I mean, it's exciting, it's to watch, but it's we're talking about really the fate of the Middle East, the fate of Israel, and we can't trust him for that. So I'm not surprised. I'm dismayed, but not surprised.
I was shocked so last time I was in Jerusalem was in February. we had dinner right before I went to the airport. And this was, so Trump had been in office for maybe a month, and I was shocked being in Jerusalem and how much Trump love there was everywhere. I mean, not just in conversation, but posters and everything was Trump, Trump, Trump. And even the way I know it's for their own reasons, the hostage families really love talking and buttering up Trump and talking to him.
And he's responsible for the most recent release of hostages.
Right. But I'm wondering, since the last visit that Netanyahu had to Washington recently, it didn't go kind of as well. Do you still see, all of us here, in Canada, he's really messing with things here. It's really crazy and awful and scary. Is that a feeling in Israel with this Iran stuff?
Not yet. Israelis, I think, still feel tremendous gratitude to Trump, justifiably, for moving the embassy to Jerusalem, even though he was warned at the time that it's going to lead to violence throughout the Arab world. Nothing happened. And there's tremendous gratitude to Trump for recognizing Israeli annexation of the Golan Heights and any number of other moves that Trump did. So, but as has been noted in other contexts, Trump 2.0 may not be Trump the first term. And I think that might be playing out in Israel as well. And, Israelis respond to love. And Trump gives Israelis love. And Biden did too, but he also criticized, and Israelis don't like criticism. And even if it's coming from a genuine friend. Trump's love is generally unconditional, and he certainly doesn't care about the moral issues involved in the conflict. He's more than happy to give Israel a pass on that. And so there is that gratitude when so much of the international community is really a kind of a lynch mob against Israel. Trump has been steadfast. But I think that Iran is more important than saying nice things about Israel.
So my last question for you, Yossi, and then if you have questions for me or for us, we'll take them and then open it up. Israel, clearly, we have a close relationship as diaspora Jewry to Israel. I think it's grown in some ways much stronger over the last year and a half. And I think also seeing Israelis living here in Vancouver and in the diaspora have felt closer to the non-Israeli Jewish community in really meaningful ways. Do you have a sense, and I know you're involved in both worlds really a lot, but do you have a sense of how Israelis are thinking about diaspora Jewry right now?
Well, one thing that I sense among Israelis since October 7th is a new humility toward the diaspora, that we may not have all the answers. And it might not be such a bad thing for the Jewish people to have Jews in different parts of the world. You hear that among Israelis today in a way that you didn't so much before October 7th. And the Zionism of Israelis has taken a bad beating. The psychological after effect of October 7th is in questioning the durability of the Zionist promise to create a safe refuge. October 7th was such a profound blow to Israel's self-image that it, I think, inevitably has bearing on how we relate to the diaspora. There's also, as many of you I'm sure know, a growing emigration from Israel. 90,000 Israelis left in the last year. That's a very high number. And we know who left. That's an even bigger concern. It's people coming from the elite. It's people who are the backbone of the Israeli success story. So everyone has relatives. Every Israeli that I know has relatives, family, Israeli relatives in the diaspora, as do my wife and I here in Vancouver. And so there's really a humbling, a necessary humbling. I wish it had happened in a different way, obviously. But I think that the relationship to Israel, to the diaspora, is much softer and more nuanced than it was before. Israelis always cared about the diaspora when there's anti-Semitism. That's the only time you see the Israeli media really paying attention to the diaspora. Although what has begun to happen in the last year or two are films that are being made by Israeli TV production companies on the diaspora, some very fine films, focusing primarily on American Jewry, but that's something that has rarely happened before. So I think that's also a sign that amongst some Israelis there's a growing interest in the diaspora, not only the threats to the diaspora, which Israelis have always felt, well, we need to step up because that's our job, but also what happens, what's the Jewish life like in the diaspora, which is a question Israelis rarely, if ever, asked before. And so there's a new openness, which I think is very hopeful for the future.
Do you think Israelis think about how Israel impacts the life of Jews in the diaspora?
That's the next step that needs to happen. I think that the Israeli public doesn't really understand that what we do and the decisions we make or don't make, for example, not stopping the violence of settlers in the territories, how that impacts on diaspora Jews. And even just on the most basic level of being able to defend Israel, but also how it impacts on the standing of Jewish communities that have the Israeli flag on their bima and are implicated in what we do. That's something that has not yet penetrated Israeli consciousness. So I do have a question for you, and that is, I hear that there's an election coming in your country.
Don't forget to vote.
And how is the Jewish community divided? Very, very divided? Is it 50-50 divided?
Honestly,
is it 70-30?
I have no polling on the Jewish community. I'll tell you what I do here, is that, and this might be being the rabbi of Temple Sholom, a Reform progressive community. There are a lot of Jews, Canadian Jews, who feel politically homeless right now, who have felt not just about how the government or individual members of parliament vote or speak about Israel, but about our own safety and well-being as Jews living in Canada, has been at the forefront of our minds. And there's been a lot of disappointment from government in responding or ignoring or covering eyes to the anti-Semitism we see around us. And I think there was, I remember when I was saying earlier to you, Yossi, that when I first moved here, so this was in 2011, I heard a lot of young adult Jews talking about they no longer feel like Jews are one-issue voters, that time was kind of passing. And I'm hearing a lot more people who talk about, well, I really, I think about these issues that way, but I'm really mostly, like, the concern for the Jewish community is primary in my mind. So
that's interesting because it's different from the previous generation, which voted for Israeli issues. This is voting for Canadian Jewish interests, and that's probably new in Canada.
I mean, it's certainly new within the last few generations, I would assume. I mean, I'm a sort of new Canadian, but I'm getting my it's my first federal election this time. But yeah, I think it's definitely not just about Israel. Was it always only about Israel for being a one-issue voter? I'm not really quite sure, but we're feeling our own personal well-being as Jews being part of what we are considering in our votes.
Is that new in Canada?
I'd have to ask the rest of the group. For me, I think it is, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that a lot of the anti-Semitism that we're experiencing and feeling is coming from, like, systems in Canada. It's coming from unions. It's coming from schools and universities and things like that, where we think there should be, this is supposed to be the land of good governance, and there should be ways for this to be dealt with more appropriately, and it's been hard and disappointing. So it's definitely something to consider. Now, I would say a lot changed since the tariffs and everything with Trump has impacted the election very, very dramatically. So we'll see. Okay, we're going to take some questions. I will give the first honor to our esteemed president, Daniel Steiner.
Presidential privilege, I guess. Thank you very much for taking the time and meeting with us. I love your podcast. I'm sure a lot of people say I'm a groupie. If Israel had a leader other than Netanyahu, in an ideal world, a functional, reasonable leader, how do we get to peace? How do we get the hostages home, somehow get a functional relationship with the Palestinians? What is a path forward if you put aside the fact that Netanyahu wouldn't do it, for lack of a better term?
Well, if by peace you mean an end to the conflict, no Israeli leader could achieve that, because there's no equivalent leadership on the other side. There never has been, and there still isn't, that is ready to make the kind of deal that even the Israeli left could live with. So I don't see any possibility. Right now, we have a government that is the political and moral equivalent, in some ways, of the Palestinian Authority. And for the first time, the Palestinian leadership has the Israeli leadership it deserves. And there's a certain symmetry between the Ben Gvir, Smotrich, Netanyahu government and the kind of leadership that the Palestinians have had all the way through. This is new for us, to have this kind of extreme leadership. For the Palestinians, it's normative. So this is the first government since 1967 that has made annexation of the territories a stated goal. It's in the platform, the government platform. And no government, including Netanyahu's previous many governments, ever placed annexation as an official goal. It's the first government that is blatantly disinterested in a peace agreement. In the past, even right-wing governments, including Netanyahu, at least paid lip service to the idea of a two-state solution. That's over, at least for now, with this government. The likely replacement, if elections were held today, Naftali Bennett would return to power. He would set up again a coalition of left, center, and right. And Bennett is actually more of a genuine ideological right-winger than Netanyahu. Netanyahu is, in the past, I would have called him a pragmatist. Today, he's a pure opportunist. The pragmatist is the positive side. Opportunist is the negative expression. Today, Netanyahu has become a complete opportunist, which again was not the case, I believe, in the past. So there is no, a Palestinian state is not on anyone's agenda right now, including for the Israeli left and certainly for the center. It's not a topic. And October 7th, at least for the foreseeable future, has made discussion, political discussion, around the Palestinian state kind of suicidal for an Israeli politician. There is no sympathy for a Palestinian state in Israel, for very good reason. There's the deep fear that a Palestinian state on the West Bank would essentially become a Hamas state, and that would be sitting on our most sensitive border, which overlooks Tel Aviv, greater Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem. But there was a very interesting poll, which didn't get anywhere near the attention that I thought it should, about a month or so ago, Tel Aviv University poll, asking Israelis, in the context of a regional agreement led by the Saudis, peace with the Arab world, would you accept a Palestinian state? 60% said yes, and that really surprised me. Now, the question, of course, is what kind of Palestinian state? I don't believe after October 7th that the Palestinians will ever get the state that they were offered at Camp David in 2000, July 2000, or by Clinton 6 months later. A state, basically a sovereign state that is more or less the 67 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital. That's not going to happen. Right now, for me, the most pressing question is, how do we begin winding down the occupation? Because that, for me, is a disaster for Israel. I'm much less concerned with the Palestinian state and more concerned with ending the occupation. And they're not necessarily the same thing. There are ways in which we could gradually lessen the occupation without leading to full Palestinian sovereignty, which almost no one in Israel is willing to take a chance on now. In the context of a regional agreement, as that poll indicated, attitudes can change. Circumstances can change. The only conceivable way that a Palestinian state, in whatever shape, can be created post-October 7th is if Israel has peace with the Arab world, and Arab countries are heavily involved, not only in investing in Palestinian infrastructure, but also in monitoring Palestinian terrorism together with Israel. And I could foresee a pan-Arab security force working together with the IDF to maintain a certain level of security in the West Bank. In other words, there are openings, there are possibilities that were inconceivable before the Abraham Accords. And so on the one hand, you have October 7th, which says nothing can happen. And on the other hand, you have the Abraham Accords. So these are the two kind of poles, certainly the two psychological poles that are playing out in Israeli consciousness.
So I'm going to take two more from this side, then I'm going to take a few from that side to be equitable and save my legs.
Thank you. If I may squeeze in two questions. Can you hear? Okay. So firstly, Netanyahu has always struck me as someone who's been very concerned about his legacy. And it feels like he's destroying his legacy. Presumably he loses the next election and then gets exposed with all of these things. So would love to hear your thoughts on that. And the second thing is Turkey, what your thoughts are on Turkey and Erdogan.
On Erdogan?
Yes.
Well, that second question is easy. I think Erdogan is one of the most dangerous leaders in the Middle East. And the irony, of course, is that for many decades in Israel's early years, the two Muslim countries that Israel had peace with was Iran and Turkey. And today I see Erdogan leading Turkey closer and closer to the Iranian model in terms of its relationship to Israel. The one ray of hope there is that Turkey and Iran are bitter rivals, and that could play out in Syria. So everything is volatile, and the Iranian-Turkish-Israeli dynamic is very fluid. In terms of the question of how Netanyahu perceives his legacy, I think you're right. For Netanyahu, that in some ways is an even higher priority than holding on to power. And my sense is that what he's doing now in Gaza is not only to make sure that the far right doesn't quit his government. The far right said that if he makes a deal on the hostages and ends the war, they will bring the government down. I think and he certainly is concerned about that, but I think his even greater concern is about his legacy. And Netanyahu seems to believe that if he can defeat Hamas, he will somehow wipe the slate clean with October 7th. Netanyahu he of course has taken no responsibility for October 7th. It's as if Bennett was the prime minister on October 7th, and they didn't wake him up, so he has no responsibility for being the guy who funded Hamas for years, for being the guy who persisted with the judicial policy, even though the entire security establishment warned him for a year leading up to October 7th that you're bringing the country to a security disaster. And there was no secret. Those were headlines, banner headlines in Israel. So, but Netanyahu has no responsibility for that. When he speaks about October 7th, he forgets the date. He'll say October 6th, he'll say November 7th, and it's a pattern. I've heard any number of Netanyahu speeches where he gets October 7th wrong. I don't know any child in Israel who doesn't know the date of October 7th. And it is Netanyahu's one memory lapse. Other than that, he seems to be doing just great. So there's something in his twisted psyche that believes that his legacy has not yet been set, it has not yet been determined. I think it's irreversible. The judgment of history on Netanyahu, I believe, is irreversible. But he thinks all it's going to take is bringing Hamas down, and so he is willing to sacrifice the remaining hostages. And what you hear from his supporters, Likud members of Knesset and others, is don't forget that Netanyahu has brought back 85% of the hostages. And he's brought back the most vulnerable. He's brought back the women, the children, the elderly. Some have died along the way, of course, but nevertheless, that's their argument. And the implicit conclusion of that is the ones who are left are young men, are soldiers, and soldiers are dying in Gaza at the front. And so this is part of war. And I think he's setting the stage for sacrificing them in order to defeat Hamas, to ensure in his mind that his legacy is protected. That's what I think is really going on. And it's extraordinary, but that I think is what we're facing.
Hi, Yossi. Again, thank you for this, and I look forward to studying with you this summer at Hartman.
You're coming to CLP,
Yeah.
to Hartman? Great.
Yeah. So the first is you touched on the Abraham Accords, and so it seems like any conversations with normalizations with the Saudis, we haven't heard anything, so I'm just curious if you know of anything there. But the deeper question I have is really from something that I read that Danny Gordis wrote this morning. I don't know if you read his piece this morning, where he was kind of recapping the Seders that they had had. And at the end of it, they had this rule, no politics at the Seder table. And that only...
Good luck with that.
Exactly. That only went so far. And at the end of it, so I was reading it this morning, at the end of it, it was clearly a question that one of his kids raised, which was essentially when Ben Gvir, if or when Ben Gvir becomes prime minister, is that when we leave Israel? And I'm asking that in the context of the fact that, so I am a child of this congregation living now in the United States, serving a congregation in Westchester County in New York. And in some of the conversations that we have with some of our congregants, you're starting to hear people say things like, like if and when I leave the United States, like how bad does it have to be? Or playing, what do we talk about when we talk about Anne Frank game? Like who would take you in if things get really bad? But reading this piece by Gordis kind of shocked me because are Israelis even having that conversation? I mean, you mentioned 90,000 have left, but the thought that things could get bad enough there that people would then choose to leave Israel?
Some Israelis are having that conversation. I would even say many have had that conversation. And it's mostly, of course, among liberal Israelis. The hypothetical about Ben Gvir, I think, is not serious. He's not going to become prime minister. I think he thinks he's going to become prime minister, but that's not going to happen. I won't say that things are as bad as they can possibly be because, there's an expression in Hebrew, is just when you think you've hit rock bottom, there's a knock from below. And so we've heard lots of knocks from below in the last couple of years. But there are other ways in which I've heard the Ben Gvir question phrased, which is if the Temple Mount becomes fully open to Jewish prayer, and we seem to be on our way there. And the reaction within the Arab world makes peace impossible with the Saudis, for example, and it would, and leads to a regional war, which is possible. It's only the Temple Mount that has the power to do that, to galvanize large parts of the Arab and Muslim worlds. Do we go to war? Do we send our kids to war? Do we participate in Ben Gvir's Temple Mount war? That's a question. We're not there yet, and even Netanyahu is a bit afraid of the Temple Mount. He's weak. He's not imposing his will, but Netanyahu does not want this to be happening. He understands the consequences. But the question about how bad can it get? Look, in Israel, we have a very strong society. We have weak institutions, but we have a very strong society. And I think in the U.S., or at least I would have said this until Trump came to power, you have very strong institutions and not such a strong society. I don't know how strong your institutions are anymore. I'm a little bit shocked at how quickly Trump has succeeded. I'm less shocked to see how vulnerable Israeli institutions are because it's a more politically immature society. But the society itself is very strong. It's strong in terms of its social interconnectedness, family connections, the chevra, the friendships. It's a very strong society. And I know lots of people who would never leave Israel because of their social connections. And I think it's probably true for most Israelis. And there's also something that my wife says to me, which is that Israelis don't do well in other places outside of Israel, socially. Being Israeli is a very particular kind of social animal. And being Israeli makes total sense in Israel. Being Israeli outside of Israel makes a little less sense. It's difficult. And I think that also is a mitigating factor. So in other words, look, I still think that love of country and patriotism is very strong among Israelis. But beyond that, there is the social dynamic, which keeps people home. And Israelis who have left come back. 2 out of 3 of my kids were living outside of Israel before October 7th. My son came back as a result of October 7th. He was living in the US for 7 years. And he decided after October 7th, he can't bear not being with his friends, not being part of Israel. And so was that a patriotic response? Yes, to some extent, but it was much more, it's home, and home is in trouble now, and I don't want to be living among people who hate my home. So it was very visceral. And when I look at my son and his friends, I think this is really the success of Zionism, because it's normalized Israel. And it's normalized it to such an extent that you feel protective of it, not necessarily or not only for big Zionist reasons, but for very simple emotional reasons of home. And that's very strong. And that's something that I don't think the early Zionists understood the power of home, because it was all abstract and ideological.
I think that one thing that we love talking about in the West and that Israelis also like paying attention to is left-wing anti-Semitism. We're obsessed with the universities and what's going on in schools.
Me too.
Same. Do Israelis, are they starting to see the, I'll say, weaponization of anti-Semitism from the right wing, particularly in the United States, and the blind ignorance of actual anti-Semites in the right wing in the US as well?
Yeah, what I love about right-wing anti-Zionism is that it's so unapologetically anti-Semitic. Left-wing anti-Zionism feels that it has to pretend, no, we're not. Of course, we're not anti-Semitic, and so there still is a bit of a guilty conscience on the left. But I saw just the other day, for the first time, a serious article in one of the Israeli papers about the rise of far-right anti-Zionism, which I think is a very serious phenomenon. I did not pay attention to it until very recently. I downplayed it, and I didn't understand. Of course, I was aware of Candace Owens, but I didn't understand what has happened on right-wing radio in the last year, specifically about Israel. And it's extraordinary. So this is something that Israelis are, I think, just beginning to wake up to. And it's going to put the Likud and the Israeli right in a very uncomfortable position, because they have staked the claim that we need to throw in our lot with Hungary and far-right parties around Europe. And I think that this is going to place that strategy into question.
What about the, sorry, let me just, the second part of the question is the same question, it's the same one. Also the weaponization of anti-Semitism that the Trump administration is doing, and saying oh, these people are allegedly anti-Semites, and using that as, a weapon to deport people without due process. Is that something that Israelis are paying attention to? Because I know that middle Jews here don't know what the hell is going on.
Yes, and we are cheering. And I say we because I'm cheering as well, even though I hear the concerns of American Jews. I respect those concerns on 2 grounds. There's the concern of that any weakening of civil liberties, of democratic norms, will not be good in the long term for Jews, and I think that's true. And I also hear the American Jewish argument that Jews are going to be blamed by the left for being the pretext for Trump's assault on the universities and on civil liberties. And I hear those arguments. Bret Stephens, in today's Times, was being interviewed by someone else at the Times. And it's worth reading. And he makes both of these cases very strongly, and I have enormous respect for him. I still think, and this is a very Israeli thing to say, so what? And I so what because something changed fundamentally for American Jewry in the last year and a half. And that is that its children were turned into public enemies on American campuses. I spent a fair bit of time going around campuses over the last year, and it was really depressing speaking to kids in Hillel across the US and to see what they were up against. They were turned into pariahs, and they were abandoned. They were abandoned by the Biden administration. They were abandoned by the traditional camp of American Jewry. And I don't think that many American Jews have fully internalized the fact that they are now a different kind of minority. I think you in Canada have internalized the change because you're a smaller community and the balance of power is against you. And in America, they still feel the power of numbers, and America is America, and all the rest of it. But this notion that I understand the argument about civil liberties more than I do the argument that Jews are going to be blamed. You know, it reminds me of, the old Jewish joke of two Jews are being blindfolded and they're facing a firing squad. And one says to the other, "Don't we get a last request?" And the other says, "Quiet, you'll make things worse." And I don't think American Jews are before a firing squad, but the changes that have happened in the last year and a half are so drastic that there needs to be pushback. And so you have this bully, this vulgar bully coming along, and whether he's cynically using the issue or not, from my Israeli perspective, is irrelevant. He's pushing back. He is starting to deport people who should be deported. Whether they should all be deported or not, that's going to be a legal decision. Anyone who passes the legal bar and a judge says, yes, this person can be deported, from my point of view, why should American Jews be defending those people? They just turned your kids into enemies. And so there's something in the American Jewish defense mechanism that seems to me broken. That Jews have been so at home in America for these last few generations that they don't quite know how to cope with not being fully at home. But they're not fully at home anymore. They were not at home in the campuses that I visited. And I was at Columbia, for example, and I asked Jewish students, if you knew then what you know now, would you have come here? Every student in that room said no, they would not come to Columbia. So something has been broken. And Trump is not breaking anything. Trump is dealing with something that's already been broken. Now he's breaking it more, of course he is. But if you can't support Trump, be quiet. That's the message. I've been lecturing in the US, and that's what I've been telling American Jews. If you can't support him, don't say anything.
Thank you.
I told you, you can't. Israelis don't work in other contexts. It doesn't, you know. So, it's the kind of conversation that if I said this in any Israeli forum, left, right, or center, people would just shrug and say, well, yeah, of course.
Excuse me, I have two questions. But the first one is, the situation on the northern border between Israel and Syria and what has happened with the collapse more quickly than anyone expected of the Assad government and how Israel quickly moved to take more territory. What do you think is going to happen there over the next year? In part because of Erdogan and his involvement as well.
It's very possible that we may have some military clashes with Erdogan forces in Syria. That's a scenario. That's a scenario that we're preparing for. I don't believe we're leaving those enclaves. I think we're there for a few years for certain, till the situation becomes clearer. There is, and certainly that's one of the advantages of having Trump as president. Trump will not put pressure on us to withdraw from Syria. I think the Biden administration might have.
And the second question is far away from that. You mentioned your comments vis-a-vis Colombia. What are your comments vis-a-vis the position that Harvard is taking with Trump?
Of Harvard,
Of what Harvard is doing vis-a-vis refusing to accept the Trump conditions for receiving aid?
so there's really an overlap of issues here. There's the anti-Semitism piece of it, which is guaranteeing that Jewish students will be protected on campus, ensuring that pro-Palestinian demonstrators can't cover their faces. They need to be accountable. They need to be recognizable. There are lots of elements to that. Then there's the question of Middle Eastern studies. Middle Eastern studies departments are active political centers of anti-Zionism. Much of what we're seeing on campuses has been nurtured by Middle East studies departments for the last 40 years. And this didn't happen in a void. And so the demand that Trump made to Colombia, which Colombia agreed to, was that it needs to place its Middle East department in some form of receivership or supervision. I don't know exactly what the arrangements there will be. And Trump had a similar demand of Harvard, which Harvard has declined. The other issue is DEI, the fate of the DEI departments, and the place of conservative academics at Harvard. These are separate issues. There is some relationship, I believe, between DEI and the suppression of conservative academics to anti-Zionism. There is a thread there, but they should be treated as distinct issues, and Trump is treating it as a package. So I haven't followed it closely. I know that in this issue I am on the side of the administration rather than Harvard, but that's a visceral response and not really looking at the details.
Thank you.
I have just a quick question. How to repair Israel's image in the world? Because that has been, it's difficult. I know, it's a simple question with many answers.
That's a 6-month seminar. and
is it repairable? Maybe.
I think that I'm always asked that question because it's such an important question. But invariably, when I speak to a Jewish audience, that question comes up, and I have a new response to that question, which is I won't respond to it. And the reason I say that is that we need to rethink our approach to that question. There's no quick answer. We have been caught unawares by a process that has been building up for decades. And it broke into the mainstream on October 7th, but the ground has been laid for the last 40 years for sure, and certainly in academia. Middle East studies is one of those culprits, but not the only. Much of the social sciences have been preparing the way for the settler colonial narrative on Israel. And part of the problem, and I don't mean this for you personally, because I think this is something that's shared by virtually the whole Jewish community, is that we haven't yet made the switch, that it's not going to be an answer that a speaker can give, because it's so systemic that it's going to require a really serious effort by people who have thought deeply about these questions to come together in think tanks, in small groups, bringing in experts from different fields, from media, social media, PR, historians, sociologists, activists. There needs to be a new approach in the same way that the anti-Zionists prepared the ground. We need to take a generational approach, a long-term approach. Now, we do need at the same time short-term strategies. We need to be putting fires out. So we need a multiplicity of strategies. We need young people who know how to work social media. And there are some terrific people out there, kids out there, who are defending Israel night and day on social media. And they should be getting unlimited support from the Jewish community. And that's not happening. That's just one example. So they're putting out the fires. You need people who will be thinking long-term about campuses. What does it mean to start pushing back against Middle East studies departments? Trump has done the first pushback, but there needs to be an intellectual pushback against the entrenchment of anti-Zionism in academia. So there are so many levels to this. We need to think about media, but this is really something that should be happening now. And the fact that it still isn't happening, I think, is because we haven't made the switch yet. And we still think that if only Netanyahu wouldn't do that. Yes, he's made things immeasurably worse, but he's not the culprit, the primary culprit for the situation we're in now. And so the solution is not going to be tinkering with Israeli policy or getting our message better, because it's not a question of the message. We are on the wrong side of a deep and historic cultural divide that has opened up in the West. And Israel is perceived, rightly or wrongly, as being on the wrong side of that cultural divide. And that's the question that we have to deal with. It's a cultural question and not a political question, ultimately.
So I think we have time for 2 more questions, so I'll take one from each side. Who am I? Okay, Karen.
I was reading this in the English language Israeli news, not recently like this week, but in the last few weeks, about concern about civil war in Israel. How do you think about that?
I don't think that the government has the soldiers. I mean, if you look at the demonstrations that have been happening the last weeks, this is a kind of civil war that's happening now, in the middle of a real war, which is unthinkable. But the streets are filled only with anti-government demonstrators. The government hasn't succeeded in organizing a single pro-government demonstration. Now, they could do it. They could bus in people from the settlements. They've done that before. They've had 10, 20,000 people out in the streets. They haven't had 100,000 people. And what does worry me is that Ben Gvir has distributed tens of thousands of guns in the last year to citizens. And there is a concern of a kind of unofficial militia that might be out there. We don't know. But that is a worry. And what the Netanyahu government is trying to do is portray the Shin Bet as a renegade militia that isn't beholden to the state. It has its own agenda, its own anti-government agenda, which is, it's a crime. It's a crime against the country. And will Israelis, even Israelis on the right, take up arms against the Shin Bet? That's not the country that I know. So I don't think so. I don't rule anything out anymore because we've seen the inconceivable happen. But I still think there are some red lines that won't be crossed. And if, God forbid, there's an outbreak of sporadic violence, which is certainly possible. We've had examples in the last 30 years of right-wing violence against Jews, the Rabin assassination, the grenade thrown into a Peace Now demonstration in 1983. There are examples of this. The rest of the society, I believe, including most of the right, would be so appalled that it would quickly suppress it. So I don't think so, is my cautious answer.
Okay, one more, I think. Shell in the back.
Thank you very much for your insightful talk. I have a question that goes back to where we started. That is around you talked about the demonstration in Israel and the protest against Netanyahu. I mean, in this city, as you're well aware of, people assemble on Sundays to remember the hostages or to kind of walk for the freedom of hostages. Every week, I get scolded by my 92-year-old sister-in-law in Israel. How can you go there and never, ever raise the issue about how Netanyahu deals with this? This is a woman who is 92 years old, go from long distance with a bus to go every Sunday to demonstration. Well, I often go here. And this raises the issue. I mean, how should, as you see it, Jews in the diaspora deal with this? When we march, or we go every Sunday, is that an indirect support to Netanyahu? Not that people at all think in those ways, but by kind of bringing out the hostages with not really indicating that the government of Israel has a responsibility.
Look, during it's a very good question. During the year leading up to October 7th, the year of the judicial upheaval, I joined with Danny Gordis and Mati Friedman in writing an open letter to diaspora Jews, urging them to participate in the movement to protect Israeli democracy. In this case, I think that the issues need to be separated. Not in Israel. In Israel, when we demonstrate for the hostages, we're very much demonstrating against Netanyahu. But here, I think the focus needs to be put relentlessly on Hamas and not to confuse the issue by bringing Netanyahu in, even though I believe he bears at least some of the responsibility. I don't know how much. There are people in Israel who believe he is, including many of the hostage families, believe that he is the main obstacle. And the truth is that if your position is that the war should end, that the hostages need to be saved, even at the price of ending the war, which, as I said earlier, is now the position of 70% of the Israeli public, then of course Netanyahu is to blame because he could end the war and bring the hostages back, and he's not doing that. But I don't think that that's the emphasis that diaspora Jews should be placing on the hostage issue. You have to keep the focus on Hamas and on the fact that the international community has abandoned the hostages, with a few notable exceptions. So there, I would say, I would make that distinction on this particular issue.
Thank you so much, Yossi.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wonder if I can ask you one last maybe recommendation to the group. Is there anything you've read lately, seen, a piece of music, something that's filled you and you could recommend to all of us?
Yeah. There's a new album out by Eviatar Banai, who I think is the great Israeli singer-composer of this generation. It's always a Banai, it's a family of singers. Now it's Eviatar. And he has an album out called Sichot Shalom, Peace Talks, which is about the process of internal healing in Israel. And it's fantastic. It's just an extraordinary album. It is some of the, I think, best songs of the war are on this album. And it's something we should just study. That we should just study that album. And maybe we should talk about it. And it's so rich. And so look it up, Sichot Shalom, Eviatar Banai, and many layers of meaning there. I'll just say one comment about the song after which the album is named, Sichot Shalom. Eviatar Banai compares Israeli society to a 12-step meeting. And everyone at the meeting has a different addiction, and everyone represents a different part of Israeli society. He also puts himself in there, and it's quite touching. He's one of the people sitting there. And then, so that's one level of the song. The next level is that this meeting is happening in a bomb shelter. And people are opening up to each other in the middle of this war. And his point is that what we need a 12-step healing program coming from the bomb shelter. And it's a great song. So
Sounds wonderful. So want to let everyone know we're going to have one more session with Yossi on May 8th. So that's a Thursday. It's going to be on more of a study session on the topic of Eviatar Banai, apparently, or Jewish approaches to power, one of the two, or both. But we're really looking forward to having you back for that as well. I do want to just mention while we have a captive audience, some of you are aware of the World Zionist Congress is coming up. And this year, something different is happening with Canada. Usually, the Canadian representation is just proportional to the communities that are represented, and for the Reform Movement of Canada, it's Arts of Canada. This year, there actually is going to be a vote, and we need everyone to vote to help to bring the values of our Zionism, our progressive liberal values, and what the Israel that we want to see and care about. And so we're going to be talking a lot more about this. It's going to officially open for registration on April 30th. The voting will happen in June, but I just wanted to put that on everyone's radar. If you have questions, I'm sure Shirley Hyman would love to talk to everyone about it. So I wanted to let you know about that.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because even more than values, it's about money. It's about a lot of money, billions of dollars. And will that money go to strengthen fundamentalist Israel, or will it go to strengthen liberal Israel? And this is actually an area where diaspora Jews have a decisive say. I tried to register, and I couldn't because I'm Israeli. I can't vote. I vote in the Knesset, so I can't vote in the World Zionist Organization. And the irony of this is that the World Zionist Organization is a very, forgive me for saying, but it's a very problematic organization. And it's an organization that probably should have been shut down years ago. It wasn't. It is entrusted with billions of dollars, and that money needs to be protected. And so please register and vote.
Thank you so much. All right, thank you so much, Yossi. I want to wish everyone Chag Sameach. There's a little bit of a Pesach reception in the social hall, so please join us.